Um, Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Knowledge Network on Climate Assembly annual event. I can't quite believe we've been in operation for 2 years now. Well, I guess I can in terms of the aging around my eyes and around, kind of my loss of hair. But apart from that, it's been fabulous that for the past 2 years we've been able to do some really interesting work together around this still very novel and innovative mode of citizen engagement around climate. We've got a really exciting agenda today, but I'm not going to spoil things. I'm literally going to pass over to my colleague Mark from the Danish Board of Technology, who's going to tell us a bit about what we're going to be doing. And I'm almost immediately going to come back talking about a report we've just launched. But I'd like to pass over to Mark, who's going to be our host for the next 3 to 4 hours. Mark, over to you.
Well, hello, everyone. Yes, I have the wonderful honor of guiding you through this afternoon. I'll tell you a little bit about what we're going to be doing. And as Graham hinted, he'll be getting the word in a moment as well. But first, let me just remind anyone who hasn't been a part of the Knowledge Network for a longer period of time what we are and why we're here. So, the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies was set up with funding from the European Climate Foundation, with the vision really to play a part in creating ambitious, effective, and legitimate climate policy and governance that's informed by deliberative engagement with citizens. So that's quite a big vision. And the way we've been working towards that is to try to improve commissioning and design and implementation and impact of assemblies by really bringing together all the people who are experiencing this firsthand, either as practitioners or researchers or commissioners or stakeholders in climate assemblies around, well, mostly Europe, but really the world. So we're trying to bring back all the best experience and gather it as best practice examples of how you can work with climate assemblies. So this is really what KNOCA is all about. And it's important perhaps to say that we have an emphasis on 2 things, knowledge and network. So we're really trying to do all this work together with you, together with people who are interested in or passionate about deliberative processes or about climate, and who work some way around this field. So that doesn't mean you have to be directly engaged with this. You can also be here as someone who's curious about this work. Either way, welcome. It's a pleasure to have people here again. And as you've probably noticed, the meeting's being recorded, so you'll be able to see this again. If anyone doesn't like to see your faces recorded, you can turn off your camera. Now, we've been around for a few years, and in a moment, Graham is going to take you through some of the learning that we've had during this period. And we're doing this under a headline of emerging trends, challenges, and opportunities in climate assemblies. So the first session we're going to go into is just under an hour, and that'll really be about the Knowledge Network itself. And we'll try to share some of the most important learnings we've had and some of the things we think are relevant to focus on to improve climate assembly practice. Now, we have 3 sessions today, and they're really working independently. So this first one will begin in a moment, but then at 2 o'clock, a new session starts. Here we'll have 9 members of our network, people that are engaged around KNOCA, that are working with different types of assembly practice. And all 9 will come in and show us something from their work. So innovations or new open questions that they're dealing with that's kind of at the forefront of the assembly practice. So that'll be a more interactive session. We won't record that session though, so please do join it. It'll be breakout rooms where we'll be able to engage with each other and discuss some of these issues. There'll be 2 rounds, and the total amount of time for the session will be almost 2 hours. And then we'll come back for a 3rd and final session at 4 o'clock. And here we'll be meeting 2 really interesting people from different areas of the political spectrum. So we have from Denmark, which is where we are as well, at the Danish Board of Technology, where I'm working. We have the head of a political party called The Alternative, which is Denmark's Green Party, and which have historically been working a lot with citizens' engagement. And we also have from the European Commission, Gaetan Ricard-Nihul. He's been very engaged with the Conference on the Future of Europe, and the European citizens panels that have just finished recently. And she's the head of a secretariat working with citizens engagement within the EU. So she is also a very interesting person to be talking to. And that session will be about the how to anchor the work we're doing inside politics. So these are 3 sessions. We'll give you lots to think about, hopefully, if you stick around for all of them. But they are, you can join them independently, and they'll make sense in their own right, hopefully. So just to say one more word for those who don't know so well. So you've seen Graham a moment ago. He's the chair of KNOCA. I like to say he's the knowledge part of the knowledge network, and the network part would be me and my colleagues. So you'll see a few people with a background similar to mine. I know Morten is here, Nana's here, Stine is here, and Bjørn is here. So we're some of the people from the Danish Board of Technology that really have the task of bringing the network together and convening us as a network. So you'll see a few of us over these next few hours, but right now what you'll see is our chair, Graham Smith, talking about his latest research. So Graham, the floor is yours. You are muted though, Graham.
Someone had to start that way, didn't they? So can you see the screen? Can you see the screen okay? Yeah, fantastic.
Yes, perfect.
So Mark just said my research. This is not my research. This is a summary of the kind of research and guidance and all the workshops we've run through KNOCA, and we've tried to synthesize it into a short report, which was published in April, the end of April, and is available on the website. And hopefully, Stine can share, Stine or Nana can share the link to the report. It's not very long, so that's its main virtue. And what we thought it would be useful for us is just to sort of do a little bit of a stock check about where we are in relation to climate assemblies. And really happy I'll be talking for about 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll have a bit of time for Q&A afterwards. Really happy for people to throw questions into the chat, and Mark will pick up on some of those. So just to reinforce what Mark was just saying, we're a European-based network, although about sort of 1/10 of our network is actually from outside Europe. And the aim of the network, which was funded by the European Climate Foundation, is to document existing practice, to identify and disseminate best practice for impact, and to shape future practice. And we do a lot of that through commissioning research projects, commissioning or knowledge development projects, through workshops, and also through closed events that we hold with governments and with civil society organizations to help improve their practice. At the moment, we've got somewhere over between 650 and 700 members from about 39 different countries. So it really is very spread. And most of you, if you're here, you know where the website is, but that's where we try and house our materials. So Mark already said that our question for this event, but to be honest, our question just generally, I think, for KNOCA is, how can climate assemblies be integrated more effectively into our political system so that their impacts on climate governance are more robust and sustained? And so really, we start from a position of thinking that there are good reasons to be interested in climate assemblies and in participation in climate governance more broadly. And this is a sort of what I've put here are the kinds of arguments that people put forward. And one of our questions is, do assemblies actually achieve these ends? But the kinds of reasons why people want to see participation in climate governance are diverse. They range from the obvious, I guess, which is the ensuring that we have more robust and ambitious climate policy that reflects the interests, needs, and attitudes of citizens. There's an argument here that too often climate policy is neglectful of the everyday lives of citizens, and we can shape better policy if we involve those citizens in that process. That through participation, we can hopefully challenge embedded social and climate inequalities. And most of us probably would recognize that there are certain lobbies within our politics that are able to dominate climate policy in a negative way, in sort of stopping the emergence of more robust policy. That participation can help break political deadlocks where they exist between, at the political level, and increase the confidence and willingness of political leaders to act on climate, who are often worried about what is it that citizens will say. Well, assemblies provide them with motivation, and also you might even say cover at points to act in ways they might feel they lack confidence to do so. It also, as we start the transition, the climate transition starts to bite, we're really going to see climate policy affecting everyday lives. And the argument is that if we can involve citizens in that policy process, in that transition process, it will increase public legitimacy and acceptance of those actions. And finally, one of the things that we recognize through participation is a way of actually developing more climate aware and politically confident citizens who have been through that participatory process and are more willing to take individual and collective action on the climate. So there's all sorts of reasons why we might be interested in participation in climate governance, and citizens' assemblies in particular. And so what I just want to do briefly is sort of document where I think we are in terms of assemblies and the kinds of learning that we've got about it. Now, the first thing to say is just how extensive the practice has been at the national level. We've seen a lot of deliberative processes over the last 30 or 40 years. The OECD documents somewhere, I think, are in the range of 700. But very few of them are actually happen at national level, and very few of them as part of a sort of shared set of practices. And I think what's really interesting here is we've got a bunch of national governments who have run assemblies of different size, different quality, different commitments, etc. But that they have actually happened over the last 3 to 4 years is a really interesting sociological fact in its own right. So one of the really interesting issues, and perhaps the reason why we're established by the European Climate Foundation, was to try and make sense of what was happening at national level. And of course, complementing national level, we've seen a whole host of sub-national assemblies happening at the same time across Europe, mostly intensely in the UK, but also across a range of other jurisdictions as well. So when we try and make sense of what's happening, we have to, I think, recognize that not all climate assemblies are the same. And I think there's a tendency for those people who aren't so familiar with this area to talk about climate assemblies as if they all had exactly the same characteristics. They do tend to share two characteristics. One is that they are selected through democratic lottery. So we've got a diverse group of citizens who are participating. And secondly, they go through a learning and deliberation. They go through a process of learning and deliberation before they come to recommendations. But after that, there's so many differences. In terms of, for example, commissioners, there are assemblies that have been commissioned directly by executives, by presidents, by mayors, by political leaders. Others have been commissioned by parliaments and by councils and local council bodies. And others have been run independently by NGOs, by non-governmental organizations. So we start from a position where they relate to the political system in very different ways. And that, I think, means that we should have very different expectations of them. Secondly, the remits they've been given have varied quite considerably. Some have been asked to deal, if you like, with the climate crisis in totality, and have been asked questions about how does our particular jurisdiction respond to the climate crisis, or how do we achieve net zero by 2050? And others have been very specific, focusing on particular controversies or particular policy issues, whether that's issues of mobility, energy costs, all sorts of other areas. And I think there's really big differences there. And in setting those remits, what we notice is the relationship to policy processes varies as well. And I'll come back to that more in the presentation a bit later. Thirdly, these have been massively different, massive levels of massive differences in relation to resources that have been provided. So some of the national assemblies have been millions of euros, and in terms of their cost. Others have been other assemblies have been tens of thousands of pounds. And of course, when you've got those differences of resources, you've got differences in terms of what you can expect to achieve from those assemblies. Another area where we've seen differences are commitments to act by politicians and by those commissioners, all the way from some practice in Poland where commissioners have agreed to implement any recommendations that have 80% support from within the assembly, through to assemblies where there's no clear commitment on the part of commissioners to take these things forward. So one thing I think we really need to recognize as a community, and I think we do recognize as a community, is this massive variation. And with that variation comes differences in relation to impact. And I think all of us would look at assemblies and be disappointed by the extent of impact that they've had. But I think we shouldn't be that surprised on two, at least for two reasons. One reason is that these are still novel and innovative processes. There aren't that, when I say there's been sort of 12 national assemblies and up to 100 in total, that's still, that's still not that many. And so we're still learning how these processes work. And the second is, there are no real innovations in the policy process that have really radically changed policy in their own right immediately. This is part of a developing process of trying to integrate citizen engagement within the policy process. And I think that's the challenge that we face, and it's something I'll come back to in a second. But we have seen impact, and we should celebrate the impact we've seen. We should recognize that some assemblies have actually generated impact. And I'm mostly going to focus on the national level here. Certainly the Irish Climate Action Bill from 2020 and the French Climate and Resilience Bill that went through in 2021 are stronger because of the impact of climate assemblies. In both cases, many of the recommendations of those assemblies were rejected or were modified. But we should recognize that there is a relationship between those assemblies happening and more progressive policy on the part of governments. Secondly, we've seen impact on institutions. One I'd particularly like from my own country in the UK is that the Climate Change Committee, which is the independent committee that reviews government progress on climate action, used the Climate Assembly UK findings to structure one of its annual climate budgets, and was trying to look at how government action related to what citizens had recommended. In Ireland, the Joint Parliamentary Committee was established to look at what came out of their Citizens' Assembly, and that was its only role. But they decided to keep it and make it a permanent part of the climate governance infrastructure within Ireland. So one of the impacts of the Irish Assembly is a new piece of infrastructure. And in Denmark, the Assembly has been given the status of social partnership, of a social partner. Then we think about impact on public. Again, the French is a really good example about the extent to which the Assembly, the convention in France, led to widespread public debate about climate policy and about assemblies per se. In Austria, we saw high levels of awareness and knowledge of the Assembly. And finally, impacts on participants. There's some really, really nice evidence from the UK that shows that the impact on members, on their attitudes and behaviours, actually increases over time. So 18 months to 2 years later, they went back to their members and found that they were much more concerned about climate. They were much more active on the issue, both individually and collectively. So I think we should recognise that assemblies have been limited in their impact, but that actually they have had impact. And that's really critical, I think. In terms of best practice for impact, in terms of thinking about what we could do better, I've selected 4 issues here where I think we are still seeing problems in relation to climate assembly practice. One is that I think we're still having problems of defining what an appropriate remit should look like. And this isn't just a debate about should we ask citizens broad questions, or should we ask them more focused questions, or should citizens have a role in setting the agenda, etc., or should other stakeholders be involved in that process? These are really important debates. I think what we haven't really done is develop the remit in relation to what we're expecting to come out of it in terms of the effect we're hoping for on policy or public debate or whatever. And I think we've got to be much more careful for that. And we also, I think, haven't really figured out whether or not citizens' assemblies are good places within which we can do systems thinking work, to actually do the kind of work of systems transformation or structural transformation that some climate activists are reasonably arguing is necessary. So there's a whole host of questions still around setting the right remit or getting that process right. The second one is around transparency and communication. It still shocks me that on a number of assemblies, you still can't find out how the people were selected. You can't find out about the governance structures. You can't find out about who provided evidence on what and at what time, and what was the structure of the assembly. And it surprises me, if you haven't got that basic transparency right, I don't know how you hope to communicate an assembly. And then when it comes to communication, I still think we are struggling with that question about what are the narratives and storylines that we should be presenting at different points during an assembly's life, at the start, during the process, and afterwards. How do we communicate this really important and innovative practice in ways that capture the attention of the media and the wider public and different stakeholders? And I think that's still somewhere where we have a lot of work to do. I think another area which KNOCA has been particularly focusing attention on is the skepticism within the climate governance world about assemblies and about whether assemblies can play an important role in climate governance. And it's been really noticeable to me how many people are really skeptical of their skepticism. Often sits on for two reasons, I think. One is a question about, can citizens really do this? Can citizens really engage with climate and take climate seriously and bring up serious recommendations? I think we've got plenty of evidence to show that that is the case. And secondly, I think there's three reasons. One is the second reason is, I think, a lack of understanding of how assemblies work. I think there's still some really basic work to do there. And thirdly, I think there's some concerns about the position of actors within climate governance, and worried that assemblies will, if you like, affect power structures within assemblies. So people defending their particular position. And I think one of the pieces of work that we've done that I think I'm perhaps most proud of, one of the ones I'm most proud of, is the work that we've been doing with climate NGOs to try and skill them up to better make the case for public participation, and also see it as critical to their agenda. And I think that's an area of really interesting work, where those of us who work on these deliberative processes need to be much more engaged with the NGOs who work in this space in order to sort of allay some of their fears and to help develop a collective movement around these processes. And finally, the area I think we need to improve, we really need to improve, is integration within the political system. And as I'll say in a minute, this isn't always integration as in government commissioning is best, but to actually make sure that these processes fit within the policy process or fit within broader political processes in ways that actually make sense. I think too often these assemblies are run in a way that is delinked from politics, is too much delinked from public administration or from social movements. And I think we really need to figure that out. So what I'd just like to just end with, I've got a couple more slides, but it's really focus on what we're going to be doing over the next year to try and respond to some of those issues I've raised. And I think there's a number of projects, and I'll just go through them briefly, the first two or three in more detail, but just to mention the others. And this is, for me, I think, critical issues around embedding and institutionalization. And we'll pick these up on the final session when we talk to our colleagues from the EU and from the Danish Parliament. The first is embedding climate assemblies. And this is what I was talking about in terms of one of the aspects of integration. And what I mean here is that climate assemblies are taken seriously. When they're run, they are actually run in ways that affect the political process. It really was striking when I asked people a few months ago, I asked a lot of people about, can you point me towards the guidance on how public administrations should land assemblies, should embed assemblies within their works? And there isn't much out there. Almost all of the guidance is how to run an assembly, but not how to embed that assembly within the political system. So one of our really lead projects is about providing guidance on the role of civil servants, the role of politicians, the role of stakeholders, the role of members themselves in that embedding process. And I think that's a really crucial and critical area. The second and related issue is about institutionalization, about making these things more regular. Most assemblies have been one-off, and there's no way you're going to respond effectively to the climate crisis if you just think you can do it in one shot. So the question is, can these become more permanent parts of climate governance? And we've certainly seen in places like Brussels and Milan, they're trying to establish these things as a permanent part of their governance structures. And I purposely separate embedding and institutionalization, because I think you can make something permanent and it has no effect whatsoever. So the issue here is, can we embed and can we institutionalize? And then there's a whole bunch of other projects which are in different points of development. We're hopefully over the summer producing a report on communication. We are just about to produce the playbook for climate NGOs that helps them think through how to engage with assemblies. Again, another report will be coming out from one of our Danish colleagues about how best to select and present evidence within assemblies. And then I guess a bunch of projects which are going to be, we'll see a series of workshops on, or further workshops on over the coming months around how to engage different stakeholders in the process. So we've talked about NGOs, we've talked about, but what about other stakeholders? What about business? What about other institutions apart from the sponsoring institution? What about other civil society organizations, and what roles can they play in relation to assemblies? How do we support participants after the assembly? We did a really nice workshop on that a few months ago, and there'll be further development of that work. And then I think a really critical point is that KNOCA in its first 2 years has mostly been focused at national level. We've brought in a lot of experience from local level, but not as much as we could. And I think we are going to do much more work on looking at what the innovations at subnational level are, because there's more of these assemblies happening at local level. So I think much to learn. And then some of you were involved in this workshop last week, in fact, which was we're going to develop a second iteration of our impact evaluation framework. We think too much of the focus, again, the focus is so much on the experience of citizens, what happens in the assembly itself, and not on what happens afterwards or what even happens before, and trying to understand what that impact is and how we could better manage that. Hence, we're trying to push towards an impact evaluation framework. And what that means over the coming months is we're going to produce much more comprehensive and accessible guidance. Our aim is to produce some really short guidance notes on different aspects of assembly practice, which points towards more detailed supporting evidence on our website, but also on amongst other actors like OECD, like FIDE, like New Democracy, and others who have done really good work in a number of these areas. And we're trying to synthesize that and bring it all together. So finally, my last slide, I actually just want to say a thank you, because for many people on this call, you've been involved in many of our workshops, and it's been really a fabulous process to try and co-create knowledge together. It's a really difficult process. It'd be much easier if I could just sit in my room and write some notes and just tell everybody how I think things should be done, but much more fun and much more challenging to try and co-create that. And I think over the last few months, we've run a series of really excellent workshops on things like the impact evaluation framework, on questions of systems transformation, on questions like the use of scenario planning, the use what to do, how to work with assembly members after the assembly, on those issues that have been bothering all of us, that all of us are trying to figure out, and trying to bring people together and try and understand the contours of that has been really wonderful. And that's been done through a series of workshops and other activities. It has been really productive. And I think because we go through that process, I think we're better able to try and shape the future together, because I think that personally for me, I'm a really, as you know, a great advocate of assemblies, but I actually only want assemblies to happen when and if they're going to have impact. I don't think there's any point running assemblies for the sake of running assemblies. We only should be doing this if we can really see that it's going to have significant impact, both on the climate crisis and the broader ecological crisis, but also on what I see as sort of democratic backsliding as well. The idea that this is a really important development, both for climate and for democracy. And I must say, over the last 2 years, it has been a lot of effort on our part and a lot of work with you, but most of all, it's been a lot of fun. And so I'd like to thank you all for the past couple of years, and I look forward to working with you over the next year as we further develop this process. And please do have a look at the reports, and please send your responses. What did we miss out? What did we forget? What should we be focusing on? Because this, our intention is to update this report every 6 to 8 months in order that we can keep up to date with emerging trends, with challenges, and with opportunities. And at that point, I shall stop my presentation and pass back to Mark.
Great, Graham. Thanks for kickstarting this. So Graham has shared a lot of different thoughts, and really for the remainder of this session, which is the next 20 minutes, we have an open floor for questions or comments. So this can take two directions. It can either be questions directed to what you've heard Graham say, but it can also actually be input from you guys, because we know that among our members, there's a lot of wisdom and a lot of thoughts that are worth getting into the mix. So you're really invited to do both. Now you can write things in the chat if you want to. We've already got the first, but if you have anything, then go ahead and raise your hands. But Graham, we did have a first question from Michelle or Michele in the chat, which is basically about how much we know about the impact of climate assemblies on the broader public. So basically, have people changed their views on climate change? And I know that there's been quite a few different types of work done on trying to assess the impact of assemblies. And perhaps you can say a little bit about what we know about how they impact the broader public and some of the challenges that we also identified on this, because there's clearly more work that needs to be done in this area. So Graham, what can you share?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's actually the area where climate assemblies, if I'm honest, have been weakest. I mean, there's a few examples, a small number of examples where that hasn't been the case. So the French Convention, I think, is really an outlier in a positive outlier in the way that it actually led to wider public debate. And I think one of the reasons why that was the case was because it was commissioned by the president, and the president made outlandish claims about how he was going to respond with no filter to this. So it was something that the media really latched onto. And they had a very, very active media strategy with members being involved in a way that some assembly organizers have been a bit reluctant and a bit nervous about doing. And I think one of our problems here relates to one of the issues I raised is I don't think we've really worked out how to communicate assemblies. I think there's a real problem of trying to get media attention onto assemblies. And although a number of assemblies have put a bunch of resources into this, they've had real problems of getting that kind of media attention. And I know that some assemblies are trying to innovate in this area. So the Irish Assembly on Biodiversity Loss, which we hope to run a learning call on in the autumn, they embedded a couple of TikTok influencers in the assembly in order that they could use that as a mode of media influence. So I think one of the real problems we've got here is trying to take what happens in the assembly and bringing it to wider publics. And I don't think we've cracked that nut. There is some evidence that you can do it. As I say, there's a small number, but actually trying to get that kind of media attention, trying to get that sustained interest from journalists. And one of the problems here is that assemblies don't fit the current narrative of politics, which is about conflict, which is about really focusing on controversy. And here you've got a group of citizens trying to work collaboratively, trying to develop recommendations in the face of the climate crisis in ways that aren't familiar. So it's trying to take that unfamiliar, package it in ways that responds to sort of media dynamics in ways that will capture people's attention. And I think that's really, it is a real challenge. And I know, for example, the Swedish Climate Assembly that's going to be organized later in the year is really focusing on that, attempting to engage the broader public. And I know they've got a strategy of trying to bring in key media influencers into their orbit in order to make that happen. And I think that's really going to be, a really interesting one to watch. No pressure, my Swedish colleagues, but it's going to be interesting to watch.
Thanks, Graham. So feel free to raise your hands if you have any questions. I feel like adding that one of the things about communicating climate assemblies is that for politicians, I think most politicians find that there's a lot of people from the media automatically interested in opinions of politicians, but for some strange reason, there's no legitimate interest directed from media towards climate assemblies, which is a real issue if you want climate assemblies to be a legitimate part of the public debate. And I just wanted to reflect back on our last workshop where two of our participants, two researchers that have been working on the impact evaluation framework that we were doing, Ramon van der Doos and Julian Frida, I think, forgive the names, I'm not good at those, but I think if I recall correctly, both of them were stating that actually there's something paradoxical about the notion of doing a climate assembly, because the moment you've had citizens through this kind of process, they stop being representative. They become kind of a small expert panel. So this was their opinion, but of course what they were really saying between the lines is that does that then mean that they stop being representative of the larger or the broader public? Because really, if you want climate assemblies to be legitimate, do they then need to be in a very strong dialogue with the broader public? And if so, is there actually a real issue in the fact that we haven't cracked this nut yet? So I think those are very interesting and relevant questions. So Tim, you're the first to raise your hand. Feel free to state your question or share your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Mark. So it's a kind of related question in a way in terms of how society and the public is reacting to climate assemblies. And just sitting in Sweden, where we've seen an increased politicization of the climate issue, do we see any kind of trends on how climate assemblies have interacted with polarization around climate change and particularly responses of more populist parties towards the climate threat? Ideally, there should be a way to kind of bypass or overcome that, but you can see in ways in which they might be sort of framed from different sides. So is there any kind of general trend or picture on how climate assemblies have interacted with those trends that we see in our politics?
So I think I just did a quick check to see whether Eva Bordas was here from Demnet, and I don't think she is, unfortunately, because obviously she works in Hungary, and I think that's if you think you've got it challenging, you want to have a look at Hungary, the kind of Hungarian context. And also I know a couple of our colleagues maybe here from the Shipyard Foundation, they might want to chip in as well, because they've been running they recently ran a national assembly very much with that focus on trying to how do we deal with these sort of things in a polarized context. And I think one of the things that I've learned from talking to Eva is it hasn't been consistent in the way that polarization, the broader polarization, has affected the way that the Climate Assembly has been dealt with by political parties. In some ways, she's had support from parties you might not expect. In others, she's found that that assemblies have been really attacked by particular parties. And I think we do. Tim and I were having this conversation earlier today, actually, and it's a conversation I've had on a number of occasions. Is I think we don't do a good job of communicating assemblies, particularly in a more populist, right of centre vernacular. By using that word vernacular, I've just already caused a problem. Is that we tend to, a lot of the people in this space tend to have a more progressive view on climate policy, on democracy, but I think there is a populist discourse around climate assemblies about bringing everyday people into political decision making, which we failed to make. And I think one of the things that we need to do in relation to our communication strategies is to think about the different audiences that we communicate to. And we haven't done that kind of work of how can we communicate assemblies in ways that resonate with different segments of the population and different segments of the political arena. So I think there's definitely lessons to be learned from our Eastern European colleagues who have been running these things in highly polarized societies. And again, there's also something to be said about the language that we use in this area.
Let me just add, Graham, that Eva will actually be joining for one of the breakout groups in the second session. So, and this will be a part of the topic discussed there. So I invite you to stick around for that and join that conversation. So we have another hand now. Oh, sorry. Small break in the recording, but we're back online. So it gave me a chance to think about how to pronounce your name, but I'm not sure if it's Sian. That's your first name, but
Sian. It's Sian.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
It's Sian. Thank you. So I'm asking this question as a councillor, and I'm also on the cabinet in my council. As a complete newbie, first time councillor, so absolutely don't know what I'm doing, but. And I'm having conversations about deliberative processes in general, not just citizens' assemblies or climate assemblies, but this whole citizen participation thing. And I come up against, so officers are quite often open to it, but they don't know how to make it happen in a climate of real serious financial constraint. I mean, desperate financial constraint, where to make a decision to just do one, let alone institutionalize them, which is what I think needs to happen. Just do, because it goes back to what you said, Graham, these are still quite new and loads of people don't know about them. And those of us that have been sort of passionate about them for a little while, forget how little people know about them, and it seems like a no-brainer to me, and I talk about them quite often as though they're a no-brainer, but I realize that people just don't understand them yet. So for me, it's about two things really. Absolutely agree with you about how we communicate this, and I'm not the best communicator for them because I just get too passionate about them because I'm really into them. And so it's about how to create resources, I suppose, for us to communicate at a pace that matches the person or entity that we're communicating it to, in a way that they can accommodate it and understand it as you go. And also to have connected with that and in alignment with that, for me, I think would be really useful. And it's the second question really, is there a body of work documenting those places, and I'm thinking Brussels and Poland, where there has been to some extent institutionalization, and looking at what the impact of that institutionalization has been on the political process that it's institutionalized in, and what the experience of having that as part of their political system has been for the politicians that are there and the civil servants that work in it. Is there documentation of that going on? You know, is there somewhere we can go and say, how is it going in Brussels, or how is it going in Gdansk? That would be super, super useful if I could show living, breathing examples of where it's being done, because it takes courage for cabinets and civil servants behind them to say, yeah, we are actually going to commit this money to this because we think it would be a really good idea, especially when you know that, as you said, Graham, just doing one isn't really enough anyway. So you're committing all this money for one when you know really that for it to be meaningful, you'd have to follow it up with lots more.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of.
Yeah, no, I think yes, I can see you wrestling with how much you're wrestling with this show. On the institutionalization question, almost all of these assemblies have only these permanent assemblies have only gone through one cycle. So we're still going through that process of institutionalization. And one of the things we will do over the coming months is to try and catch up with those kind of effects that you're talking about. There is, of course, the East Belgian assembly, which is not on climate, but that's more permanent, which is now in its third year. And there's some research that's been written about that. So we'll try and bring that together in autumn. One thing in terms of costs is it's much cheaper to keep something like this as a more permanent thing than trying to do lots of ad hoc things. But it's still, I completely recognize the expense question. And in terms of your question about how do we bring people, how do we bring people into this space, civil servants who may be interested or skeptical or nervous about it, certainly we're looking at trying to develop that question about how do you build capacity within public authorities, and some of that's going to be about training, but some of it's also relatedly about peer development. We found it really interesting about bringing, if you like, matching up people where people who are in a situation like yours and are not sure and a bit worried about it, bringing them into dialogue with people who've already done it from a very similar background. So, there's nothing more helpful to a civil servant than seeing another civil servant like themselves who's been through the process and thinks it was a good thing and can talk to them about the challenges and the opportunities that it brings. So one of the things I've really enjoyed in a couple of places, we've done that where we've brought civil servants from outside who have talked about how difficult a process this is, but have always said it's been one of their peak experiences and been one of the most important things they've done. So I think that's a really critical thing. If you're trying to change practice within an institution, is bringing in friendly people from a similar institution who have been through that process. I can't see anything more powerful than that.
Absolutely.
Because they're the best advocates, and we're really happy if we can to make those kind of links and help.
Oh, great. That was going to be a follow-on question. Can you help us with linking?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
Shall I get in touch with you separately about that?
I mean, anyone can. We just info@knoca.eu and just send a request, and we'll do the best we can. Can't make any promises, but we'll do the best we can.
Great, thanks, Graham. Chris, you have your hand up, and just as a reminder, we've got about 5 minutes before we're going to jump into a break before the next session. But Chris, go ahead.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Graham, and to the whole team for putting this on. My question's on the kind of institutionalization area again, and the double-edged sword of that. And I recall Graham's point from the very first KNOCA workshop I think I ever attended on the Irish citizen assemblies, where there was a mandated citizen assembly around aging societies, and that work was done and it landed and it was completely ignored. And that was contrasted with, the unmandated work that was going on with the Climate Assembly, and where those outcomes landed in the context of kind of a pushy and an activist civil society, and they got picked up. So if you were going to cut through that, you'd say politics happened, kind of. So the institutionalized one failed, or was it that the climate one was institutionalized because it had this robust civil society around it? So it's really nuanced, right? And so I'm curious what the team thinks about what kind of mandate from government, official mandate, is worth the cost of getting it, and has the team's view kind of shifted through the process as you looked at all these different examples? Thanks.
Oh God, that's a really tough question, Chris. So first off, we haven't got a position. I think the thing is, there's about 7 or 8. It's a bit like economists. There's 7 or 8 members of the KNOCA management team, and I guess about 9 different positions on everything. So I think from my own perspective, since I've got the floor, and Mark is really enjoying the fact that he's going to have to shut me up in 5 minutes. I know he's very pleased about that. From a personal perspective, I think we still haven't figured this all out, and I think so much of it, and this is such the political scientist in me, so much of it is context dependent. It's very different what you can do in Ireland to what you can do in France to what you can do in Poland. They are just different. There are massively different contexts and actors in play. And the one thing I didn't mention, actually, I should have mentioned it when I was talking about institutionalization, is I think we have an assumption that this is institutionalized alongside government. So if you like, what I mean there is this is government commissioned institutionalization. And I think there's actually something to be said for thinking about institutionalizing one step removed from government, that actually these things might be in some places and at some points be better institutionalized in a sort of quasi-independent way, where they have a significant life of their own and almost become like a counterpower. And what I'm thinking of here, and the reason I'm thinking of this is it was pushed, my thinking here has been pushed by a couple of reasons. One is the people, my colleagues from Central and Eastern Europe, who are talking about the absolute distrust of government. And so you need to run these things independently. And why not think about this thing as being an independent, have an independent body within politics? Of course, then the question becomes, how are you going to resource that? I mean, where are you going to get the kind of funds that you need to actually resource that? But I think it's a really interesting question to ask. And again, the more radical social movements, some of which are involved in KNOCA, also making that push of saying, we don't think assemblies are going to ask the real critical questions about the climate crisis if they're always commissioned by government, because government has an interest in not dealing with some of those issues and some of the interests around government. Now, I don't have a sort of established view here. I don't have a sort of consistent view, but I take that point that we tend to think within KNOCA, and I think within assemblies, that government commissioning is always the route we're trying to get to. We're experimenting with them in civil society so that government then picks them up. Well, maybe that's not always the right way to think about this. So I didn't answer your question, Chris. I actually complicated it slightly more, but I think it's a really important question for us to be thinking about, that question of how do you achieve independence? And is that something we want to achieve?
You kept to the time beautifully, Graham. I feel like adding just one perspective to this. This may be more as a practitioner than as a member of the Knowledge Network. Really, the thing is that climate assemblies are, twofold. There's a climate aspect, but it's also very much about democratic practice. And I think one of the experiences as a practitioner is that it's important to have a focus on the fact that it's a democratic exercise, because you can't order a certain outcome from an assembly. Certainly, if you do, and you manage to get a certain outcome that you've pre-designed, then you've done something wrong in the process of conducting this. So there's very much, to me at least, a strong importance in the fact that whoever commissions this, or whoever hosts this is very strongly aware that you can't figure out exactly what's going to come out of it. In fact, that's the whole point. But it has a lot of democratic value in its own right. And that brings me to the point, which is really that the assemblies that seem to make most sense are the ones where there's a knowledge of that and an understanding of that. And there's an interest in hosting them for that exact reason. So that also obviously doesn't clearly answer the question, but it does lead us into the time for a break. So it's 10 to 2. According to our schedule, this is exactly when we break for a little bit. The next session will be about what we call it the innovation market. It'll be 9 different practitioners from our network presenting various innovations or experiments that they've been conducting. So we had a wonderful bridge to one of them, which is about some of the things that can happen when you do assemblies in high conflict areas. So come back for that at 2 o'clock. And as a small bridge as well to the session that happens at 4 o'clock, I can say that this whole question of institutionalization and embedding and how to fit it into the political system is really what that session will be all about. But for now, have a break, have a coffee, and see you at 2 o'clock.